2020 is finally over, and we'll remember it for a lot of things. One of them being that we saw way more of our nation's governors than we ever have. It actually earned the nickname the Year of the Governor, and we're going to look at why that is. Examining the role of the governor, we're going to take a month-by-month look at different things that happened in 2020 to see what governors were doing, why they were doing them, and how they affected our states. My name is Alex Smirkin. Happy New Year, and welcome to this Big Little Lesson. Alright, so it's time to talk about governors, and as I mentioned, it is the perfect time to do that because Happy New Year, it is now 2021, perfect time to look back at 2020, which has earned the nickname the Year of the Governor, and we're going to really dig into why that is. 2021 hopefully is not another year of the governor, and that's not because I don't like governors, it is because we see and hear a lot more about our governors when things in our states are not going well. And if we can remember what 2020 was like, things overall were not going very well. So it really put our governors front and center. We saw them more, we heard them more, and they were working a lot harder than usual with this never-ending job of running their states. And I have right here a list of 12 roles that governors have. And instead of going through in a typical fashion and discussing all of them, I'm going to take this month by month. So if we look here, I've assigned each role a certain month, and as we go through the calendar chronologically, we are going to examine a specific event from each of these months in a different state and see how that news story fits into filling out our picture of what governors do. So it'll be a piece-by-piece approach. We'll have a nice little recap of 2020, and then at the end we will celebrate that that is all over, and we'll know just about everything a governor does at that time. I'm going to queue up my favorite dashboard right here, and this is where we see the map of all of the elected offices we have here in Connecticut, although this really just does not change very much depending on which state you're in. For our purposes, every state is going to have a governor, so that's what we're looking at there. And we see that it is in the executive branch on the state level. So if we look down on the executive branch, we see that it is right below the president. So it has an analogous function to the president, but on the state scale rather than on the national scale. And it's next to the General Assembly, that's just what we call it in Connecticut, but that is the state legislature, which is our state legislative branch. It is analogous to the U.S. Congress, although it makes state laws rather than federal laws. So the governor will work together with the state legislature in a similar way that the president works together with Congress. The big difference is, are they dealing with federal matters that affect the entire country, or are they dealing with matters and laws that affect just one state? So this is really a good way to remember what a governor does. You can think of them like the president of the state. And here are just a few general sentences that describe what they do. They're leaders, they're administrators, they're spokespeople, they're implementers, but they are not lawmakers. They do have a hand in the lawmaking process, but they do not have the same role that your senators or your representatives do. They are really actors, they are doers, they are on the front lines, they're leading the ship forward, and they just have a role in developing laws, but that is not their primary duty. They are executives. A governor is a state's top executive. We know that they are in the executive branch, but if we think of things in business terms, an executive is a boss. So think of your governor as the boss of your state. They are up at the front. When something happens, they are the first in line to go tackle it, to lead the charge, to tell everybody else what to do. And that is why their roles were so important over this year, because as we were faced with crisis after crisis, the governor had to be the boss at the state level and just figure out how to tackle all of the challenges that were at hand. So every state has a governor, which gives us 50 total, and they're always elected by popular vote in each state. So as we know, the president is not elected via the popular vote. So even if a candidate for president has the highest number of votes, if they don't win in the Electoral College, they don't become the president. That is not the case here. With governors, it is whoever has the highest total of votes is going to become the governor. And usually they hold 4-year terms like the president does. And then things like term limits will vary depending on the state. Now, in some states like Connecticut, we do not have term limits for governor. In some states, there is just a limit on how many consecutive terms a governor can have. So you can take a little break and then you can run for governor again, and there could be somebody in the middle, and that's okay. But other times there is just a total limit. And many will go on to run for or get elected president after they're governors. And that is really mainly because there are so many similarities between the roles. They're both executives, they're both these leaders, and one really does what the other one does, just for the whole country rather than the state. So here we go. We have our 2020 calendar open, and we are going to do this month by month, combing through each month, finding a story, and talking about how that fits in with the major role of a governor in America. So January, we are starting out in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where we have Governor Charlie Baker submitting this budget proposal to the state legislature. Here it talks about how much they recommend spending, all of the different areas where they want to spend it, like local municipalities, education, transportation, healthcare, housing. It really just kind of outlines a proposal of how much money the governor thinks should be spent and where it should be spent, and then it goes to the legislature. So this is when the governor submits the state budget proposal to the state legislature. They're making the first move in this process. Now, this is not the final budget. They work with their budget office. Every state is going to have some sort of gubernatorial budgetary office. They'll have a different name usually. And then after that proposal is set, the state legislature will craft and go back and forth and actually build the actual budget bill, and it'll eventually make it to the governor's desk, like other bills where they sign, they veto, all of that kind of stuff. It does start with the governor putting forward the proposal. So now we're in February, and here we have Governor Ned Lamont in Connecticut giving his annual State of the State address. You can see a little clip of it right there. You can see where he is. You can see the big audience. This happened in February. So what is the State of the State address? It is basically the state equivalent to the President's State of the Union address. So this is a yearly speech. It's given to the state legislature, and it marks the beginning of the legislative session. So here in Connecticut, the legislative session for this year started at the beginning of February. At the beginning of this legislative session, when all our state legislators come in to start the process of making laws for that year, they get this update from the governor on what has happened over the past year. The governor will say the state of the state is good, it's excellent, it's bad, however they want to evaluate it. And they will also outline their priorities for the upcoming session. So this speech is not only a time to look back, but also a time to look forward and say what the governor thinks should be done and should be tackled in the upcoming year. So now we hit March. So March is when this year took a turn. This is when the role of the governor became even more important, because this is when we really saw the beginning of this COVID-19 outbreak in our country. And the first way that governors responded to this were through these stay-at-home orders. That's kind of the umbrella term I'll use to describe them right now. And you can see from this map, like almost every state had some sort of order put in place as that first step against COVID-19. And what exactly does that mean? So the governor issues the statewide stay-at-home or shelter-in-place orders. They'll be called different names at different times in different places, and they'll have slightly different implications depending on what the event is, who the governor is, what exactly they're designed to protect against. So they're these sweeping physical restrictions, and they are aimed at protecting the population's safety against some really big threat, which COVID-19 was/is. So historically, we saw these with natural disasters, stay at home, don't go outside, there's a huge snowstorm, a hurricane, or if there was a violent event, some really bad threat out in the streets. There was a shelter-in-place order put in the Boston area following the Boston Marathon bombing because there was this active manhunt for the bombers in the streets, things happening. They did not want any people out. They closed work. They kept everybody at home. And that's basically what we saw this year in March to some extent. In terms of the COVID stay-at-home orders, they were not necessarily as restrictive as some others if there was a more violent threat against us, but they really banned things like social gatherings, go in places like school, non-essential in-person businesses. They did keep essential businesses open, so that's things like grocery stores and pharmacies. So now we're in April. And April, we've kind of gotten used to this a little bit more. We're all staying home. And what do we do when we stay home? But we watch TV. And we saw a lot of press conferences happening. And that's because it is the governor's job to update their constituents and update the media on what is going on as they coordinate against whatever this threat is. So the president had daily press conferences. Your governor in whatever state you live in most likely had daily press conferences. Here in Connecticut we did. But the most famous statewide press conferences came out of New York, which was the top epicenter of the virus at this time. And Andrew Cuomo, the governor, gave press conferences every day. They went on for a while. The national media televised it. So these press conferences are done kind of whenever something happens that needs to be reported on. It is the governor's job to sit there and be the spokesperson for the state and to explain what is going on, to comfort their population, to tell the media what's happening so they can report on it. This comes from the governor's mouth. And like I said, usually done in the times of crisis. And we saw so many of them over the course of this year that it really allowed everybody to know who their governor was, because you would turn on the TV every day, you would see the governor at some point, whether it was the actual press conference, whether it was just the news showing clips of it after the fact. But we really never had any events that required the governor to be out in front of a camera this often, this consistently. And that's what we really saw this year in that springtime, especially in the month of April. So May. Now, May, we are seeing things get a little bit better in the areas that were hardest hit initially by the virus. And this is where we start seeing reopening plans come to fruition. And here I have a little clip from Massachusetts' reopening plan. This was unveiled in May. It had 4 phases. And if everything went according to plan, if things were getting better, then in these different phases, different things would open up. And this is a good example of a logistical plan that it is the governor's job to lead the coordination of. Now, this really exemplifies their role as an executive. They are the boss here. They are deciding how they're going to get out of this, what the plan forward is going to be. So it doesn't involve creating new laws. It's really just deciding what to do, how to do it, when to do it, coordinating with different people, with different agencies, kind of being the brain of this big machine that is going to really push this plan forward. This COVID reopening plan was a really good example of it. Nowadays, we're seeing vaccine rollout, which is another logistical plan that governors are working to coordinate, making sure that the vaccines arrive, they get sent to the right places, deciding who is going to get the vaccine at what time, the different phases of the population. All of this is a plan that it is the governor's job to lead the coordination of. So now we're into June, and this story is actually from the very end of May, but the implications of it stretched into June, so that's why I'm talking about it right now. And this is when Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota called in the Minnesota National Guard following some violent protests and riots that erupted in the state. So at the very end of May, we had the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis, which really set in motion nationwide protests about police brutality, about racial justice. And in some places, mostly cities, and most notably in Minnesota, these protests did turn into riots, and things got very violent. You see a building burning here. This didn't happen everywhere, but it happened in some places. And when things got so out of hand, the governor decides to call in the National Guard. And that is because the governor commands their state's National Guard. They activate them, they deploy them, they tell them where to go and what to do when that is necessary. Now, the National Guard is not like the active military. They're really brought in for peacekeeping purposes. And really just kind of protecting and securing a certain area. And that is why they're brought in response to disasters. Sometimes there'll be a natural disaster and you need to call in the National Guard to help clean it up. In this case, they really needed to clear out the streets. They needed to make sure that the violence stopped. And they were not really battling with anyone per se. They were just brought in to guard. They were the National Guard. They guard the streets and they try to deactivate the threats and keep people safe. So the president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. The governor does have a similar role here by being the commander of the state's National Guard, telling them what to do, where to go, why they are needed. So that is another similarity that we get to see. Now we're in July, and here we have an example of an executive order that was put out by the governor of Michigan in the month of July. Now, Michigan was a state that had a ton of executive orders. Some states had more than others, and this is a good example of one because it lays out exactly what an executive order is. So you can read it right here. The order is to close indoor service at bars, and it outlines all of these specific regulations. Now, you may be thinking, this looks a lot like a law, but it is not a law, it is an executive order, and it is basically an instruction or a directive that comes directly from the governor. It does not involve passing through the legislature like laws do. It's really from one person to the masses, telling them this is the way that it's going to be. And these are really controversial because, as we know, American government was designed so things have to pass through a bunch of different branches in order for them to come to be, so too much power isn't concentrated in the hands of one person. This is the place where people think that governors and executives in general have too much power because they can exercise these decrees on their own that may be very controversial, and that's basically what has happened over this year. So many executive orders were put out by different states, and there was a lot of resistance to them, and they can be struck down. The legislature can decide to do that. The courts can declare that, but really we have these because sometimes immediate action is needed. The president can also make executive orders, although on the national scale, so it does show that this executive authority is given to these top executives, and they usually are not used to this degree. This was an unusual year, so we did see a lot of these orders come out in August. Okay, so we're back in Connecticut, and here we see the governor declare a state of emergency in response to Tropical Storm Isaias. Now, if you are from Connecticut, you will remember because it put your power out for days, maybe even over a week. I lost it for 10 days. It was really bad. And this is important because it is the governor's job to really respond to natural disasters. They're at the helm of the ship. Declaring the state of emergency authorizes them to expedite their response, to allocate more resources to make it happen. They are in charge of coordinating with different government agencies, private companies, municipal governments to develop and execute this effort to recover from the disaster, to clean up, and to get the state back on track. And there are also press conferences to talk about what's happening, what's going on, what to expect, to update the constituents and the media. So as we saw, the power outages were the really big problem with this tropical storm. We also had a lot of trees down as well. So that's what the cleanup and recovery process looked like. So you saw the governor working with different mayors and different town governments, depending on where things were really bad. Eversource, our main electricity company, working with them to get power back, calling in crews from other states. I think even Canada they called hauled crews in from, and working with tree companies to clear out the roads, to cut up the trunks, all of that kind of stuff, that funnels up to the governor. They are the boss of getting us out of these kinds of natural disasters. September, we're staying in Connecticut, and in September, Governor Lamont called the legislature back into a special session because there were some time-sensitive policy issues that needed their approval. So, as I mentioned earlier, the legislative session usually happens on a pretty regular cycle. And in Connecticut, we have a part-time legislature, which means that they're only in session for half the year. So that would have been from February to May this year. But that got cut short because of COVID. So they went home. We didn't really finish the legislative session, but by the fall, he needed them back. So it is within the governor's power to call the legislature into session. What did they need to do? They needed to take up some time-sensitive matters. So, for example, modifications to the election to expand absentee balloting. That needed to be done with the approval of the legislature to put in place new laws for that. It needed to be done before the election, so it called them back in, and that's how it happened. Also, judicial nominations. Now, in some states, state judges are appointed, and others they're elected. In Connecticut, they are appointed, which means that the governor will nominate them, and the legislature would vote on them to see if they get sworn in to be our judges. In Connecticut, it's really similar to what we have on the national scale, where the president will nominate federal judges, and the U.S. Senate will confirm them. So that is a little bonus role of the governor, but this September, we saw the Connecticut General Assembly come back into session and resume their lawmaking process because there were some time-sensitive matters that needed to be handled. Going into October. Now, as I mentioned, executive orders, very controversial, especially this year when businesses were closed, when people were told to stay home. A lot of people thought that this was a violation of freedom. So you did see a lot of protests erupt over this. And Texas was one place where this happened in pretty full force because they are a very conservative state, very small government oriented. So we did see in October some protests outside the governor's mansion. And you may be wondering, well, what is a governor's mansion? And that's why we're talking about this right now. The governor resides in a governor's mansion, which is a designated executive residence located in or near that state's capital. So this may make you think about the White House in Washington, D.C. that the president moves to after they're elected. We have this on the state scale as well. In a place like Texas, you could be from a really far corner of the state, get elected to be governor, and you're not going to make the commute into the capital each day. You have your own mansion that you will live in during your time as governor. Every state is going to have this executive residence, and that's just a little perk, I guess, that you get from being governor. Now, this is often the site of protests and demonstrations because you can really make an impact by coming and protesting something right on the governor's front steps. And because a governor is just a single individual, it is really easy to blame them for things in the same way that we will blame the president for a lot of things, even if it does involve a lot of different parties. When it's one person, it's really easy to target them. So that's another reason why the governor's mansion becomes the site of a lot of demonstrations. People will really focus their resistance on the governor, him or herself. And that's why governor's mansions became a bit more relevant this year because we saw people out front. We had drive-by protests in Connecticut, people demonstrating against certain orders, certain lockdowns, things that they thought violated their freedoms. So November. Now at the beginning of November, we had the presidential election. After that, we saw Joe Biden, Kamala Harris headed to the White House come January. But Kamala Harris was a sitting senator from California, so you can't be both vice president and a U.S. senator, so that means that she will have to vacate her seat as a U.S. senator. What does that mean? Gavin Newsom, governor of California, has to appoint a replacement to fill this vacant seat. So this is another job of governors, to fill political vacancies, and this is most often going to happen with regard to the U.S. Senate. As we know, there are 2 U.S. senators coming from every state for a total of 100. We can never have under 100 senators. We always need to have 100. We always need to have 2 from each state. So anytime a senator cannot complete his or her term, the governor of that state needs to appoint a replacement. So the 3 times that this happens is because they get some federal promotion, which is like being elected vice president or getting appointed into the president's cabinet. We have not seen any of the latter quite yet. Joe Biden has not nominated any sitting senators to be cabinet secretaries, but we do have Kamala Harris vacating her seat, so it is up to the governor of California to fill that. If a senator dies, then the governor will need to fill that with an appointment. So this happened with John McCain back in 2018. And also if a senator resigns, the same thing has to happen. Al Franken resigned in 2018. So we had to get a replacement in Minnesota, thanks to the governor. This also applies to some statewide positions. Now what this means is, we saw pretty recently that Governor Newsom decided that Alex Padilla would become the next senator from California, and he was the Secretary of State for the state of California, so you cannot have a state without a Secretary of State. So he has to not only nominate a successor for the Senate seat, but also for that seat as well. Joe Biden also selected Xavier Becerra, who was the Attorney General of California, to be the Health and Human Services Secretary. So Newsom has to appoint a replacement for that one as well. This does not apply with seats in the House of Representatives, though. We will just leave those seats vacant until the next election, which would be the next November of the next even-numbered year. So we have deaths, we have appointments, we have vacancies, resignations in the House of Representatives. There are so many of them that those seats will just remain vacant. There is no constitutional process for filling that seat, so that is not going to be in the governor's hands. And finally, we're still in California, we're still looking at Gavin Newsom, and we see that there is this growing recall effort against him. Now, you may be wondering what a recall is, and that is when there is this process led by voters to remove the governor from office. Now, this is different from impeachment, where it's in the legislative branch's hands to convict the sitting officer over some criminal thing that they did. This can really be done in most places that allow it with no grounds at all. So in California, for example, people are objecting to his handling of the pandemic. They're objecting to taxes. They're objecting to homelessness in the state. All of these reasons that they are calling for his recall. And how does this work? It starts with a petition. So in California, they need to get 1.5 million voters to sign this petition for a recall election. Once that petition is filled out, then there will be this recall election, which is a 2-phase process. One is a vote on whether or not to recall the governor. Another is a vote on who is going to replace him, if so. So most frequently, this process happens on the local level with city council members and mayors and things like that. 19 states allow governors to be recalled. Some states require certain grounds to do it. California is not one of them. And California also always is attempting to recall their governors, it seems. They've attempted it 55 times. They were successful once, and that was in 2003. They recalled Governor Gray Davis over some budget-related issues. Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected in that subsequent recall election to fill his seat. And Gray Davis is actually only the second governor at any time to be recalled. The first was someone in North Dakota back in, I believe, the 1950s. So this doesn't happen often, but it is something that's playing out right now, and it shows that governors are really not immune to attacks. They get blamed for a lot of things, and in some cases, it not only tarnishes their reputation, but it can actually get them kicked out of office before their term is over. And here are just a few other attempts from this past decade to recall governors. As we can see, none of them reached the ballot. So California this time may be different, although in 2019 somebody attempted to recall Gavin Newsom and that did not work, but maybe this will be different. There is a lot of ammunition now, so we will see what happens there, but that concludes our 12 roles of the governor going through month by month. You can take a look back right now to see them again, to review them again. But this really should have allowed you to not only learn about what governors do, but also relive different parts of the year, look back on them and see just how crucial governors were, just how massive of a role they played in this year. And as I said, hopefully 2021, things will be better. We're not going to need the governors to do as much work. Who knows what 2021 will be the year of, but hopefully it is not the governor. So that concludes today's lesson. I wish you all a happy, healthy new year, and I'll see you next time.